Okay, well, so now we're going to turn to a topic that has never been more urgent after a presidential campaign than the topic of the role that the media has played, did play, is playing now. And I think we want to also expand this to discuss the potential relationship between the new president and the media going forward and how that could all play out. So without introducing everybody, because I gather that you've seen all of their bios, these are all experienced journalists here, with the exception of Steve, who's just experienced at everything, all things political. Let's start with the question that, it depends obviously on who you talk to as to what everybody says the media is at fault, but it definitely depends on whether you're talking to Democrats or Republicans. So let's start with the question that you most often heard from Democrats and people who were not for Trump. And that is that the media created Donald Trump in the first place by providing massive amounts of free airtime on cable for him to speak without any kind of analysis, just in the early parts of the primary. And you saw, if you hadn't seen this before, but there's a famous quote from Les Moonves, who's the head of CBS, who said, "This may not be good for the country, but it's good for CBS," because it was producing such great ratings, which were producing revenue. So starting, and rather than having each person, give a talk, I think we want to just kind of bounce around and discuss some of these issues a little bit. So Betsy, you're from TV.
Yes.
Why don't we start with you? I mean, do you think, what did the media do something wrong? Did television do something wrong? And if so, what was it, and what should have been done instead?
Thanks, Linda, and thanks for having us here. Delightful to be here with you all. So I do think this question of did the media create Trump is very valid, but also, did Trump create this massive media attention to start off with? I mean, thinking back, he had a long span of exposure, if you will, on The Apprentice, Celebrity Apprentice. He was a celebrity in himself. A person like that decides to run for president. Of course there's going to be media attention paid to him. That's only natural. But I think where it went overboard and excessive was this notion of everybody dismissing him and saying, oh, he's not serious, and then people putting him on the air, CNN running his rallies unfiltered. He'd be able to, call in, we mentioned that earlier on the other panel, be able to call into television shows. But the important thing to realize is that Trump is a master manipulator of the media. He was able to do that very effectively in sort of what I think of like phase one of this campaign. He knows a thing or two about leverage, right? And he had a lot of leverage at that phase of the campaign. People were interested in him, and he knew it. And he was able to dictate the terms on which he would make appearances on news programs. Calling in his bathrobe, for instance, for quick 10-minute interviews. He was able to do that very effectively. And then I think you saw the tables turn after the primary, and I think a lot of people collectively in the media like, uh-oh, what happened here? And then I think things started to turn, and he started to get much more critical coverage, negative coverage, and then he himself turned against the media. And we had, a case of presidential candidate standing up at campaign rallies, calling the media scumbags and liars, very unprecedented to have ever happened. So I think the answer kind of lies somewhere in between, but no doubt he was able to really manipulate the media a lot in that early phase of the campaign.
Well, let me ask Jonathan and John over here. Did we do something wrong? Did we do something? I'm in the media business side now, but did the media cause the election of Donald Trump by affording this platform for him? I mean, was there really anything that could have been done? It is, after all, as Les Moonves says, a business.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, John. Well, yes, I think the media has a lot of responsibility in the creation of Donald Trump. A lot of the things I've said in the first panel, so I don't want to repeat them. But as Betsy was talking, I was reminded of something that another journalist friend of mine said to me early on in the campaign, during the Republican primaries, and she said, because I was writing lots and lots and lots about Donald Trump and my concerns about him early on in the campaign, and she said, stop paying attention to the messenger and start paying attention to his followers. And I should have paid attention to that when she said it. I didn't quite get what she meant then. Obviously, I get what it means now. And I think that if the press writ large had paid as much attention to the people who were showing up at Trump rallies and saying they were supporting Donald Trump and taking what they were saying much more seriously, then I think we would have had maybe a more informed American electorate and certainly a more informed media. But what's happened in this election is part of a larger issue, which we hit on in the first panel and is sort of in the question that was asked during the first panel, and that is, I've long talked about the democratization of information and how it's a great thing and it's a horrible thing. The great thing is, as a journalist, when I was a wee lad, when we had the UPI machine, the teletype machines giving out the news was controlled. 3 broadcast networks, then CNN came along, then you had New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and then strong regional newspapers. As journalists, we had more information than the public did. Today, that's all changed. Now, Jonathan and I have as much access to information as everyone sitting in this room, particularly the students. You can be on your laptop and you can fact check a professor in real time if you wanted to. The downside is, there's several downsides. One is people have siloed themselves into communities and environments that reinforce their worldview. And so you end up having people who will only watch Fox, only read Breitbart, and only pay attention to those writers and those commentators who they see in various outlets. And the same is true for people on the left. And I'm always encouraging people, do yourself a service and follow at least one non-left or non-right person on Twitter or on Facebook or on television, so we at least know what other people are thinking. But as a result of those silos, we are now strangers to each other, both in terms of the media we consume, but also the politics. And then there's a larger issue of, well, what are facts? Alberto Ibarguen, who's the president of the Knight Foundation, said on my podcast that he's excited about this untamed world, uncertain world that we're in, because we don't know where journalism is going. We don't know who the truth tellers are, who are the purveyors of facts, what are facts? I asked him the question, he's a big proponent of the First Amendment. And he says, in the Constitution, in our founding documents, it is clear what the First Amendment means when it comes to freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, where it says Congress shall make no law. But he said, but what happens if it's not Congress that's abridging those freedoms? Google, Facebook, Twitter, any social media entity has more information and knows everything about anyone and everything than any entities in human history. What does that mean? And so when we're talking about the creation of Donald Trump and how we got here and the media's role, we have to take a giant step back and talk about the media landscape and our social media landscape in general and societally, if we're going to understand not just the incoming president, but the people who put him there.
Well, let's talk about Facebook, because clearly Facebook is getting a lot of scrutiny now for several reasons. Number one, as you've been discussing, the fact that either there's an algorithm or there's simply a choice that you make with what you read that exposes you mostly to news you agree with. So, there was a lot of analysis that was done about Facebook in the last couple of years that found that an algorithm was pushing that news to you. But it's also true for anybody who reads news on Facebook that you continue to get more of what you select. And so you're reading and you're sharing with your friends, and they agree with you. So you are in a world of certainly siloed news and not being exposed to the other side. In addition to that, perhaps much more worrisome, and on the issue of facts, was this kind of proliferation of fake news on Facebook, where there were these crazy stories out there like the Pope supports Donald Trump, or Hillary Clinton was linked to murderers, which was all over the place. There were several different versions of that. And they got a lot of pretty widespread distribution. So I guess the question, and maybe Steve, I'll toss this your way, because this has got to drive anybody who's in the profession of politics crazy. What can be done, if anything, to put that genie back in the bottle?
That's a really good question. I actually had written down here Facebook controversy because there was a news story just today that revealed that inside Facebook at the highest levels, Zuckerberg and his lieutenants, they're having this very conversation because there are people who work at Facebook, many of them millennials, many of them, not surprisingly, didn't support Donald Trump and are not happy that he was elected. And they look at their own organization and they recognize that while media is a business and Facebook is a business, they're aware of these native ads, they're called, that were designed and disguised to look like news and weren't news. Things like the Pope endorses Donald Trump, which it wasn't true. And Facebook, not being a news organization that has any responsibility to do fact-checking, would simply take these stories that appeared to be news, that were positioned and written with headlines that look like news, and they would allow them to be spread using very, very highly targeted social media. And inside Facebook today, in fact, there is a bit of a rebellion among the staff because they feel like their media property, their business interest was advanced or was used to advance a bunch of things that weren't true that might have had a significant impact on the outcome of the election. And it's one thing to sit here with the New York Times, which not only covers both sides but does it down the middle, and it's quite another to consider the proliferation of all these social media sites that don't have the same standards but position themselves as journalism, and what to do about it. So if the question is, can you put the genie back in the bottle? I actually think, sadly, the answer is no. But it does seem like there are some that are now more interested in self-policing, at least today, than they were last week. And so hopefully that will have some impact. But Jonathan's suggestion actually is probably the best, and that is for anybody your generation, anybody who's a student. And we do this exercise in my class, and those of you who are watching from my class, there'll be the secret question to a final exam question at the end of the panel. But we're actually, in my class at NYU in Washington, we're studying the role of the media right now. And that's why the class will be watching this. But we go through and as an exercise in class, we sort of say, okay, write down the 3 or 4 places you go to get your news. And when I was in college, it would be the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times. It would be sort of the predictable places. Places that covered both sides, that usually included a comment from both sides and tried to deal with facts and not sort of as fantasy. And that was the starting point for political debates and conversation. Today, if you look at where students are getting their news and information, it's not from organizations that cover both sides typically, it's from organizations that they agree with. And so Jonathan's advice to everybody in this room and to everybody watching at NYU in Washington is great advice. Don't wall yourself off. Don't get your news from only one source. Don't only hang out with people who agree with you on everything, because that creates an insular population, and you see the effect of it, all over society today. Frankly and happily, you don't see it here. This is a place where Democrats and Republicans come together and have honest conversations, but it doesn't happen enough anymore.
And I think you do have to be a smart news consumer as you're trolling around and looking for things. I mean, what are the headlines? FBI agents suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead in apparent murder-suicide by a reputable-sounding organization, the Denver Guardian. I mean, if you saw that, you might think the Denver Guardian, that sounds like a newspaper. I'm going to click on that and trust it. But it's one of these fake sites. BuzzFeed did a great story the other day that showed how one of these fake news stories was shared 500,000 times on Facebook, compared to the New York Times scoop about Donald Trump and his tax return was shared just a fraction of those amount of times. So it really, I think, has had an impact. And it reminded me of 2008. Remember, we had this phenomenon of the fake emails going around.
Right.
So it's just a new reincarnation of that.
Well, so let's turn to the New York Times over here, because the New York Times took this extraordinary step of the editor of the New York Times coming out and announcing that they were going to call statements and assertions which they had deemed to be lies. They were going to call them lies. So now we are talking on the one extreme about fake news, which is hard to sort of identify and decipher, and certainly if you're just you're reading quickly on your mobile device, you probably don't have the time to figure out whether the Denver Guardian is real or not. On the other hand, though, you had what would appear to be the corrective mechanism, implemented, which was the New York Times announcing that they were going to be starting to really call things that were untrue lies. And as Betsy said, it didn't have any impact. So, Jonathan, what about that? I mean, how do you Jonathan? How do you have the impact on the public's knowledge that the New York Times used to have?
First of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be back in Florence after a couple of years away. I would actually dispute the assertion that we didn't have an impact. I think the coverage of Trump had a profound impact. He was the most unpopular candidate for the presidency in American history. He was widely despised by a majority of the public. A majority of the public thought he was not qualified for the presidency, and he's going to lose the popular vote by a pretty hefty margin. So this notion that Trump was bulletproof and was somehow insulated from coverage, I just don't think is backed up by those facts. People overwhelmingly did not like him. But we're in a partisan country, and people had strong feelings, obviously, about Secretary Clinton, and she ran a flawed campaign, was a flawed candidate, and wound up having real problems with a segment of voters in some states that really matter. Some of them folks that are liberal but didn't show up to vote, and some of them who are more disaffected and showed up in numbers to oppose her. The fact is that we are in an era now where a segment of the population rejects what the media reports. They don't care what my publication reports about these candidates. They want to believe what they want to believe about their preferred candidates or party. I think that's a crisis. I think that we have had a half century in this country of people purposefully trying to undermine the media. And you can go back to Spiro Agnew and what the Nixon folks did starting in the late 60s to purposefully undermine the media and the credibility of the media. And that has happened for 50 years. And at the same time, we've had our flaws, and we've handed them some ammunition, haven't we, along the way. And I think there are valid critiques of the media, but you can't look away from the fact that you've had a long-running effort to undermine the press that has now been joined by these changes that we're talking about in technology that have made it tougher and have created some kind of displacement. But that said, I still remain confident. I still think that there's a place for impartial reporting and facts and news. Trump came out yesterday on Twitter and said that the Times is down, or some attack on us. The fact is, as my editors noted, we are actually having a sort of field day since the election, and people signing up for the New York Times. And I would encourage all of you today, before you leave here, I would encourage you all, if you care about the news, if you care about America, if you care about the world, if you want to see accountability and folks in both parties held accountable, put your money where your mouth is. Buy the Times, buy the Post.
And the Post.
I got you there.
Just in case.
I got you there.
This is being live streamed.
Because if you're feeling frustrated about what happened in this election, or if you're feeling elated about what happened in this election, in either case, there is a crucial role in democracy for accountability. And so look, the platform might change, the media might change, but I still think there is a place for robust journalism going forward. The challenge that we have is a sort of civic culture in which more and more people are skeptical about facts. And it's what Joel said. There's this sort of, sadly, this world now where people don't just have disputes over opinion, they have disputes over facts, and that's troubling. But the only way to combat that is with more facts, more reporting, more information. It's like Jefferson said about free speech. If you don't like what you're hearing, the only solution is more speech, more free speech. So go out there and get a time description and post one too.
And if I could jump on what Jonathan J. Mart said, as much as we have a responsibility as journalists to report facts or give our educated or reported decision if you're an opinion writer, there is a responsibility that you have, that the news consumer has. You know, we could work our hearts out and report our hearts out and put things out there for you to read, but if you don't read them, then what effect does that have? One. Two, when you are reading something, if it's not from Jonathan, or if it's not from me, or if it's not from someone who you know or trust, you have to be discerning before you start spreading it around. As reporters, we live under the fear of getting something wrong, of putting in the wrong link, or putting in a link to a story that isn't even from a real news source. And in the early days, you look for something, you throw in the link, and you move on. But then I, just speaking for myself, realized, okay, I found this story, seems reasonable. Who is this? What is this outfit? Who is this reporter? And many times, people are passing it around, and I will go scroll all the way down to the about. Yeah. Click on the about and see where this thing comes from.
Sometimes there's not even an about on the page.
Yeah. Right,
I tried that the other day with something. I couldn't find a word about it.
Right, and so you click on, like you said, Denver Guardian, and I'm thinking, what's the Denver Guardian? Where's the about? Who are these people? And then really hunt down and find out where exactly is this coming from. And if it's not from a journalism outfit, then there's no way you should be forwarding it around. The other thing I will say is the other responsibility you have, especially since everyone seems to be on Twitter and throwing things, retweeting things without reading them. For Christ's sake, please, if you are going to comment on someone's story, before doing so, click the link and read it.
Yeah.
I cannot tell you how many times I have to tell people, read before you tweet. I created a hashtag, Ribbit, RBYT. Whatever question you have is probably in the story you haven't read. Whatever concern you have maybe is addressed in the story you haven't read. Maybe a quote that you think should be there is actually in there. The accusations that you make against a reporter based on a headline without clicking the tweet is probably wrong. And so as much as you, meaning the public, cast aspersions and hate us and say that we're not informing you, as much as we have a responsibility to you to get it right, you have a responsibility as a citizen, as a news consumer, to do everything possible to read and learn and educate yourself on all those issues that you care about.
So, Jonathan J. Mart mentioned the notion of objectivity, and certainly something the mainstream media organizations at least believe that they do, trying to figure out how to look at both sides of any issue. And there are a couple of phenomena, and this is a truly bipartisan question because it depends on which side you heard it from, that I'd like to ask all of you about, that I've never seen as a longtime journalist and somebody in media. Number one, after the Democratic convention, when Donald Trump had gone after Khazar Khan, it just seemed my Twitter feed totally changed. I follow people like all of you, mainstream media reporters, and everybody just started going after Trump. Like, forget his critics say this, his critics say that, that was out of the sentence. Mainstream reporters were just going after him in a really, really rough, accusatory way, which was unusual. And that was praised by many in the business as kind of the Edward R. Murrow moment, where you finally, were going to say, I'm just not going to put up with this anymore. So that was, there was a debate about that. And so the conservatives and Trump supporters said, what's going on here with the media? They've completely removed any pretext of objectivity, and they are now fully in Hillary's camp, taking shots at the Republican candidate for president. So that was a point of view on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, you heard complaints all the way down to the last day of the campaign about false equivalency. Stephanie was talking about this earlier. So, Donald Trump, nuclear weapons, Hillary's email. Donald Trump and the wall, Hillary's email. Or whatever, the false equivalency in the minds of Democrats might be. Which was it? I'd love to hear the view of and Steve, why don't you jump in here too? I mean, obviously you're a Democrat, but was there inappropriate opinion expressed by the journalists in mainstream media organizations, or was there an attempt to pretend that there was balance when in the eyes of many there really wasn't? So which was the more egregious of these alleged practices? Why don't we start with you, Steve?
Well, it's interesting because I think to some journalists, their Twitter feed doesn't have the same standards as what they put on the front page of the New York Times. And to many journalists, I think they kind of believe the Twitter feed is more like the kind of communication that you might have over a drink at a bar rather than the kind of thing that you might put in the newspaper. So I actually think there's probably some legitimacy in the complaints of both sides. Certainly as a Democrat, I'll say that the equivalency that was sort of present in the coverage of Hillary Clinton's emails was alarming to me, and I think to many people who agree with me. But I think with respect to the Twitter feeds, the Trump campaign was so different in so many ways, and this is just another example, because this is a man who actually campaigned by Twitter feed and attacked by Twitter feed, put out statements by Twitter on his Twitter account. And so that kind of became the shorthand for things that happened in the campaign. And when he would attack one of his critics, he would often do it on Twitter. So I do think that as we move forward in the evolution of politics, and you see more and more ways to engage people in social media, and you see reporters doing things sort of personally that have the impact or the effect of something that they might do professionally, that's something that it's legitimate for a consumer to say, maybe they should take a look at that. But I do think it was viewed by many reporters, and I'll pass to the journalists here at the table, as something more like a conversation that you might have over a drink than something you'd put on the front page of the paper. That may have been a mistake on their part, but I don't think it was malevolent at all.
The problem with the coverage of Donald Trump was that it wasn't tough enough. I am a firm believer that the coverage should have been much more aggressive, much earlier, and throughout the campaign. He broke norms in American politics in a way like we have never seen somebody do. And I think at first there was a sense of, it's just Trump. He is sort of this familiar face in American life, and he's a provocateur, and he's looking for publicity, and we can't really take it that seriously because this is his shtick, so we're going to sort of go a little bit easier on him. When it became clear that he was a serious candidate for the presidency and was leading the polls for the nomination, I think the coverage should have become more aggressive and stayed that way. If any normal candidate, meaning a candidate who had come from the ranks of the governors or the Senate, had said and done the things that he did during the course of the campaign, the coverage would have been far, far tougher. So this idea that journalists were being mean to him, if anything, it was just the opposite. I'll give you 4 examples. He went to Maine and Minnesota, 2 states that have significant populations of Somali refugees. These historically very white states have seen in recent years a great influx of folks who have come from Somalia because they're leaving war. In both of those states, he purposefully went after the refugee community and basically portrayed them as terrorists. How many folks in this room even know that? Okay? if the coverage of Trump was really that aggressive, and he went to these two heavily white states that have had huge influxes of Somali refugees, and basically suggested that they're terrorists and a threat to the community, I think more folks in this room would have heard of that. How about when he goes to Salt Lake City and says of the last GOP nominee, is Mitt Romney really a Mormon? How many folks in this room recall that? Okay. So, I'll give you a third example if you want. Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, both of Cuban heritage. Trump multiple times said, can you really be an evangelical if you're from Cuba? Okay, so those are three examples. I give you 30 more, but we don't have time for that. Three examples of a candidate for president purposefully injecting race into the conversation in a way that we have never seen anybody remotely do that. So if you come and tell me that the coverage was too tough, and I cite those examples and folks haven't even heard of them, I think that sort of tells you the story.
And to jump on what Jonathan just said, from my position as an opinion writer, I looked at what was happening not as false equivalencies, but just different standards. So Jonathan just outlined very well the low standard that Trump was looked at by the press, because I do believe that for much of the time, maybe up until the birther apology at the Trump hotel, the press didn't take him seriously. And once he became the nominee, they took him seriously enough because, well, he was the Republican presidential nominee. Flip side, Hillary Clinton is being held to the presidential standard. The standard where we, in elections past, tough questions, tough stories. Yes, she should answer questions about the emails. Yes, she should answer questions about the Clinton Foundation. Yes, she should answer questions about her speeches to Wall Street organizations. But where it became glaring is that same treatment, that same presidential treatment was not being applied to Donald Trump. And I think that's where particularly Democrats and people who supported Secretary Clinton viewed the unfairness. How can you hammer her on emails day in and day out, hour after hour, and yet we've got a candidate who did all the things that Jonathan said, plus asked the Russians to hack Hillary Clinton's emails, who has connections to Russia, who hasn't released his tax returns. We could go on and on and on. Those are all presidential level questions that weren't asked early enough, weren't asked often enough, and even if we had reported them, and we did, and no one seemed to care.
And that's the thing, too. I think if all three of those stories that Jonathan referred to were blared on the front pages of every newspaper, people did not care. There is not a voter in America, I don't think, that did not hear the Billy Bush Access Hollywood tape. Everybody heard it. They didn't care. Where I think the media has also failed, though, they cared much more about their own economic situation. And where I do think the media failed, in particular television in that respect, there was a study done where in all of 2016, guess how many minutes were spent on issues in the presidential race by the three major networks? 32 minutes. In all of 2016, 32 minutes on issues. That's a huge failure. There was not this discussion, at least not on television, about issues that are pertinent to people's lives that they could maybe have made up their mind on voting, as opposed to, what the latest horrible thing Donald Trump insulted the latest person about.
Well, see, that is, and I was going to get to that next. I'm really glad you brought that coverage up. No, I think that's let's talk about that. Because you guys, here at the table are part of the journalism business. And so, as you say, only 32 minutes were devoted to discussions of policy by all the three networks combined for the entire year of 2016. And let me combine that with the question that we didn't quite get to, the false equivalency question. It sounds like you all think that there was false equivalency, but there was a Shorenstein study that showed that there was 3 times more, the amount of coverage of Hillary Clinton's emails by the networks was 3 times higher than its coverage of any issues of hers. Donald Trump's issues actually were covered more, his positions on issues, than hers, but her coverage the coverage, including apparently New York Times coverage, although I haven't seen those exact numbers, but certainly network coverage of her email issue was enormous. A fifth of the coverage she got over the summer was about the email issue. So rather than asking you whether there was too much coverage, let me ask you why. I mean, again, you're from TV, so why was there so much coverage?
I don't think the email issue was a stagnant issue. It's not like the media kind of came up with things to ask her about. This was an ongoing investigation. There was an Inspector General's report generated by the U.S. State Department about this. There was an FBI looked into it, the FBI letter. There was incrementally things that were happening that the government was putting out about this, that she was being asked about it. It's not as if the media just decided to constantly be dwelling on the email issue. There were things there, and her own response to it in terms of spending so much time not apologizing. I mean, anybody knows, Public Relations 101, if there's an issue, come out, deal with it, say you're sorry, move on. That didn't happen for months. So I just think that...
Well, and she created the problem in the first place. She needs to take responsibility for bringing this upon herself. So I'm not going to apologize for the coverage of a problem that she created. And if I could just make the case for the media for a minute when it comes to Trump, because I've obviously expressed some concerns about the coverage. Look, I think it was difficult because here's somebody who's out there who is saying things in a given day at a rate that some candidates wouldn't do in a year and a half of campaigning. And so we're basically doing journalistic triage, Linda. We're having to stand up there and say, what of these 20 things do we put on page one? And of those 20, what 5 do we get in the story? We're constrained by space and time. And so he made it difficult because he so overwhelmed the circuits of, the press. And we had to make decisions about what was going to be the lead, what was going to be in the story at all. And again, he was saying so many things that were false or that were inflammatory. And by virtue of that, there were things that weren't included. So it was a very difficult time, and I think we tried aggressively to sort of hold him accountable for the most egregious things, but in doing so, you can't get everything in there.
And as an opinion writer, I told this story at lunch, and I've told this before. I went to bed one night with one idea that I was going to write the next morning about something Donald Trump had said. I wake up the next morning, I'm starting to write, I'm reading the papers, he tweets something. I'm like, oh, okay, I will add this to the list of things. And I'm writing, getting close to noon. I am about to file. And this piece was on how he has defined deviancy down in presidential elections. And so now I'm now like highlighting this line, and just before I'm about to file, he does something, I can't even remember what it was now. He does something that just crashes through the floor, and I have to start all over again because it's on a completely different thing. And that was when I realized, you know what, I'm exhausted. I cannot write about everything that he does that is so horrendous to national political discourse, or it goes against everything that we thought we knew about presidential campaigns and presidential elections and the way candidates are supposed to comport themselves. And so just because of that exhaustion, I pulled way back and just decided I will watch, and then there might be something he does that is so outrageous that it will move me to write this time, as opposed to the 5 other times that hour where I could have jumped in.
It's clear at this table that everybody has a fairly similar point of view about Donald Trump and his things he said in the campaign and his candidacy and even potentially what kind of president he's going to be. But you said something earlier, which I think we really have to talk about as a profession. And that is one thing that the media did not do nearly enough of was talk to his supporters and understand his supporters. I told my husband a story about how I listened to NPR in the morning, and they did this really great job, I thought, of going around the country and just sitting down with real people and really talking to them. And I personally, on Monday morning, the day before the election, thought there was a good chance that Donald Trump was going to win, listening to people actually talk about their lives and actually, and they were not unreasonable or uneducated people. There were unreasonable and uneducated people on all sides, but these were often people who were just really in a lot of pain. So and we know that. We know, obviously, we missed, a lot of things. Why didn't the media spend more time with the old-fashioned process of talking to real voters and understanding the financial constraints on media companies and how the papers in the middle of the country are all going out of business and everything's concentrated on the coasts. How do you solve that problem? What do you do in a business where the money is drying up from advertising, where a lot of coverage is now done remotely? You think you know what's going on because you're online when you're not really in a town talking to people. How do you begin to get back in touch with your own country? Let me start with you, Steve.
Well, it's interesting because, the old famous lions of journalism, the Jack Germans and the David Broders used to do exactly what you're saying. They would go to a city, not with the campaign, not on the campaign plane or with the campaign on the bus. They would actually go to a city in advance of a candidate coming and stay for a few days after the candidate left, and they would talk to people, and they would interview them, and they would sort of get their perspective. It doesn't seem to happen anymore. The cable television outlets, which generally provide the footage that the networks use, send bright, talented, young journalistic stars who are usually, they embed them. In the last presidential campaign I did, we had our embed, and the embed is responsible for churning out coverage and making sort of news. And sometimes, I don't mean making up in a bad way, but they have to they're gonna come to them 5 times a day for 2 or 3 minutes, so they have to have something to say, and they have to have something to cover. And oftentimes these young journalists are not Jack Germond or Jules Witkover or David Broder. They're kids 2 or 3 years out of college who are relatively inexpensive, who the networks can get for very little money, and they do the best job they can, and they do a very good job, but it's just different. There was another piece, there is a journalist named Selena Zito who writes for The Atlantic and now CNN, who actually got on Highway 35, or there's some highway that goes from Albany, New York, all the way to Billings, Montana, and she drove it, and she talked to people all along the way. And she wrote a piece that came out at about the same time. Mm-hmm. And reading that piece, I was struck by exactly the same thing. I didn't think there was any way that Hillary was going to lose, but I was reading about these Democrats who had voted for Barack Obama and who were so filled with hope when he came, and who sort of lost their enthusiasm at some point, and many of them then voted for Bernie Sanders. And the reason they voted for Bernie Sanders was the same reason that many of them were going to vote for Donald Trump, because institutions in Washington and politicians had all failed them. They were sort of numb to the things that Donald Trump said. I think Brad Todd's thing about, that line that the media took him seriously.
Took him literally.
Literally, but not seriously, and the voters took him seriously, but not literally. They sort of knew he said crazy stuff. It was almost like they were watching a reality show campaign and not a normal presidential campaign. And Donald Trump seemed to understand that, and none of us, certainly I didn't. I actually thought it was kind of on the level, and it would conform to the rules that we always, that we've all learned over many, many hard campaigns and hard lessons. And this campaign simply didn't conform to any of those rules. And I do think that the financial constraints that media organizations face probably will make it impossible for that day of kind of reporting to return. I mean, Jonathan can speak to it better, Betsy, but there's no question that there weren't very many people doing what Selena Zito did this last month, and there weren't many people doing it during the last year of the campaign. They would travel with the candidate, they would get on the plane, or they would get on a different plane, they would go to the event, they would get in the press pen. They wouldn't have access to Donald Trump or, frankly, Hillary Clinton very much, and they would simply have to cover what was fed to them. And I don't know what you do about it, but it is a big problem, and there are still a few journalists out there who are trying to push back on it, but it's kind of depressing.
We're in this period of post-election donning of the hair shirt, shall we say. We learned a lesson that polls are not pure science, that you have to be skeptical of polling. But guys, I don't think it makes any more sense to do a story based upon lawn signs, five anecdotal conversations in a coffee shop and crowd size than it does going off pure polling. I mean, I think that the lesson of this campaign is that it's important to do both, that you have to look at data and also do real reporting too. I mean, we can't just say that the way now to cover politics is to come back from a couple of days in the community and say, well, what were folks saying in the coffee shop? What did the guys say on the street? How many lawn signs were there? I mean, that's folly. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It just means that there has to be a sort of both-and approach. And I have to say, I'm struck by this notion that there wasn't a lot of reporting about the white working class. My colleague Cheryl Stolberg, at the end of the campaign, had a really good piece about a black enclave of Philadelphia and what folks there thought about this election. And so much of the reaction to that story was, this is a welcome change. And this is a really sharp piece. And it's a welcome change from all this coverage of white working class voters. So I just don't think there was a sort of lack of that. I mean, I can cite a piece that we did from a town in North Carolina, a piece that we did from Youngstown, Ohio. My friends, at the Post did a ton of stories. So, I get there's the sort of sense after the election that we in the press have to, don the hair shirt. And my goodness, there are definitely lessons to be learned. But I'm just kind of dumbstruck at this idea that there wasn't coverage of white working class Americans during the campaign.
But I think
there was tons of it.
But I think the point is there was coverage, but it was almost as though, because most of the press is, just by virtue of economics, are live on the coast.
Sure.
You live in cities, you live on the coast.
Sure.
So you drop into a little town, you spend a few days, it's almost like, you've encountered aliens because this isn't the way you live your life. And then you go back to your cities. Right. And because newspapers and media organizations in the middle of the country are struggling to stay alive.
Yep.
So you don't have reporters who actually live the life of the people who we're trying to report on. I mean, I think you're making an excellent point. The New York Times certainly did a lot of venturing out of the country. And there was definitely reporting along those lines, probably less reporting in minority communities. I think there was a certain pretty good level of reporting on the fear amongst Hispanics. I think that was captured reasonably well by the media. But what do you do about the disconnect, by virtue of nobody's fault, it's just economics, between the way that journalists live their lives and the way that so many of the people of Donald Trump's electorate live theirs?
Well, that is a big question that comes out of this election, and that it's part of what I wrote here as sort of, for us in the media, I think, some sort of course correction, where we have to take a step back and look at, okay, what are all the things that we did well, and what are all the things that we need to do better? And I do think the idea of going back to the old days of Jack Germán and just getting into the community, spending time and talking to people, that sometimes the old-fashioned ways are still relevant. I mean, how else are we going to understand who Americans are if we don't go in there and spend any amount of time? The other problem is, as you were just saying, because we're losing the strong local press, there's only so much the New York Times can do. There's only so much the Washington Post can do.
Right.
Strong local community papers are disappearing. And
that's
so
the challenge. Yeah.
Right. And so as much as it's wonderful, Jeff Bezos, God bless him, jumped in and bought the Washington Post, and as a result of doing that, he saved the paper by giving an infusion of money that allowed the paper to hire the people necessary to get back to doing what we do well, and that is report stories and get people out there. If only there were 10 or 20 of people like him who could go into regional hubs and say, we're going to purchase this paper, or we're going to do this television station or radio station and bring the journalism that used to be there, bring it back. And the other thing, last point I want to make, you mentioned a story that Sheila did in the Times. Larissa McFarquhar at the New Yorker wrote a very compelling story about Trump voters in West Virginia. And I was interviewing her on WNYC, so I was reading her piece to get ready, and I had one preconceived notion about what this story was going to be about. I thought it was going to be yet another story about white working class voters who were voting for Donald Trump. And instead, the first anecdote is about a Muslim American who's supporting Donald Trump. And then I keep reading, and the next person was a Latino American who was supporting Donald Trump. Then the next person highlighted was an African American who was voting for Donald Trump. It's in stories like that, when you have reporters who are willing to break out of the silo and break out of the narrative, go into a community to find out what is the real story. And so that story and other stories were the ones that had me on the edge of my seat thinking, could he could win.
Right.
Because if she can find these folks
Amazing.
seemingly so
Yeah.
easily,
Yeah.
then there is something there, and that we have to pay attention to that as a political matter, but also as a journalism matter.
So we've been talking a lot about, as Jonathan says, the hair shirt, and also trying to figure out,
Rightfully
how,
so.
Yeah.
but also how we do a better job of just reporting what's really happening on a story that obviously everybody feels like somehow we didn't get it right, we in the media. But let's talk about, before we go to our questions, because we're getting close to the question point, about the concern that exists amongst journalistic institutions about what might be the fallout from the very tense and even sometimes hostile relations between President-elect Trump and the media. I mean, obviously, you have what Betsy was talking about in the campaign. You had a lot of very angry words exchanged. Reporters were confined to a pen, which has really never happened before in a campaign. And the president-elect, got and said in a fit of anger that we should strengthen our libel laws. And so there's been a lot of extrapolation from these things that happened in the campaign. Today, the public editor of the Washington Post, Margaret Sullivan, wrote a piece about how we really have to protect the First Amendment. We cannot allow it to be endangered by gradual restrictions on the press and so forth. Do you think, at this table, that the First Amendment is in danger here? Or do you think this was just hot air in a campaign? Again, the president-elect did not take a press pool with him when he went to the White House. So that was important because they're supposed to be following him around everywhere. But do you think in the end that it will have just been rhetoric and not action, based on what you've seen and heard of what he said?
I think we're definitely off to a bad start. I mean, this whole notion of, a President Trump is going to be different than a candidate, we are off to a bad start. I mean, he just went on a Twitter rant a couple hours ago against the New York Times, and, he's ditching the press pool and everything else. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what the press corps looks like in a Donald Trump White House. I think the importance of the First Amendment, and Margaret Sullivan, I think, makes a great point at the end of her piece, is it comes down to whether, the larger universe considers what we do as journalists relevant and important, and the First Amendment relevant and important. And so it's those voters that give what journalists are trying to do their relevancy at the end of the day.
And anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Well, it just does seem like, there's the old saying, you never want to pick a fight with somebody who buys ink by the barrel.
Yeah.
And that's still true. I mean, Donald Trump, I have no doubt, is going to try to limit press access. He's going to try to put reporters in a pen. He's going to probably try to write their stories for them to the extent that he can. But I have every confidence that the people who are up here today and the people who are out there covering him are not going to tolerate it. And, I wasn't, Jonathan, actually being critical a moment ago, because I think the answer is more coverage and more persistence on the things that, frankly, people got numb about. And I think the press, if there is a lesson to be learned here, is probably going to do as Jonathan suggests, which is continue to cover this guy aggressively and continue to call him out when he says or does things that are reprehensible. And I think the great leavening effect here might just be the Republicans in Congress, because every member of Congress has to stand for re-election every 2 years. Every senator is going to have to, 2/3 of the senators are going to have to face re-election during Donald Trump's time in office. And if the press can't tame this president of ours, I suspect that some of the people that he has to rely on every single day up on the Hill will put added pressure on him to kind of clean up his act. I'm hopeful. That hasn't happened yet, but I do think the pressure is only going to get greater on him to start acting like a president and not like candidate Trump.
So I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to all of you. And that is the phenomenon of Breitbart, which is obviously the website of which Steve Bannon is the president. It's called the alt-right. And, there was a piece, I think it was in the New York Times this morning, about how it has great plans to grow. And the editor-in-chief said they were going to be endorsing Marine Le Pen. So it may be that just by virtue of being so tied to the White House, the whole alt-right news approach is going to really be growing and expanding. So let me just finally throw this at you, J. Mart. So how does the New York Times, or will the New York Times, do you think, be competing in the future with Breitbart?
Look, I think all news outlets compete with any content that's now online. That's the world that we're in. A link is a link, right, Kevin? I think so. If there's stuff on there, then people are going to be reading that, and they'll be reading, all kinds of other outlets. I mean, there is a sort of flattening effect on news consumption, and it gets to your point, Linda, a minute ago about. The real story is that it's not the Times and the Post. It's the fact that the Chicago Tribune and the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Columbus Dispatch have had a rough go of it. And that's what you lose, is that people who live in let's just take Ohio. Instead of having a robust Columbus Dispatch or Plain Dealer, those papers are being thinned out. A lot of the copy is from wire services. There's less reporting. There's less folks living in those communities, writing for those papers, who are in touch with their communities. And so, and you add in technology, and if you're in those states and you're a news consumer, you're a voter, you're increasingly getting your information online from national and or partisan outfits like Breitbart, and increasingly less from, solid, credible, dispassionate local journalists, and I think that's played a huge role into the polarization in this country. And given technology, it's hard to see how there aren't going to be more Breitbarts starting up. But let's just hope that the Trump presidency does, remind folks of the importance of serious down the middle journalism, and create more incentives for folks to pay for it.
And Linda, just before we go to questions, if I could, those of you from my class who are watching, the answer is La Pietra, Florence.
Okay.
You know who you are.
Okay, so let's open it up to questions. And we, as Ellen said, we do want to start with the students. So any students in the group who have any questions before we turn to others? Okay, then go ahead, Kiki.
So can we spend a little more time talking about the dissolution of local media coverage? So in all my years as a press secretary and participating on 6 presidential campaigns, the first time I met Linda Douglas, I was the communications director at the Democratic National Committee, and she was a national correspondent for CBS. And as much time and as attention as I paid to her, I could also name Wendy March at the Tampa Tribune. I could name R.G. Ratcliffe at Texas Papers. I knew every local political reporter, Tom Baxter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And
they're all probably working for PR firms.
Say what?
They're all probably working for
a lot of them. But a lot of my professional time and activity as a campaign staffer went on them rather than the nationals. And I don't know that that's the case today.
I think it is when you're talking about sort of the free media time of the campaigns, knowing if they get their person on like live at 5 in a particular city that they're interested in, then that still goes on. But knowing the reporters, working the reporters, they're not there. A lot of these papers don't even they've gotten rid of state house reporters. They do some certain amount of accountability for the state legislature and governors. Those are mostly all gone. Like Jonathan said, it's mostly wire copy. Another thing, we're talking about getting accurate polling in from some of these small areas. Polling is expensive. And a newspaper like the Cleveland Plain Dealer probably doesn't have a couple $100,000 to spend on a local poll, and so you don't get sort of accurate when we're thinking about this election and getting sort of accurate numbers from states like Wisconsin and Michigan. They weren't polled very much by the local newspapers.
Well, and Betsy's making a really good point about Statehouses. When I was a local reporter in California and LA, We used to have a Sacramento reporter who covered the Capitol. And then I went once a week and covered the Capitol when I was a full-time political reporter, and then I moved to Washington. They didn't replace me with another full-time political reporter. They completely stopped covering the Capitol. California's the size of a country.
Yeah.
And now that's true all around the country. And had we been paying more attention to state legislatures, we probably would have already had a better grasp of what was happening in the country that led to this election. Because a lot of that was already playing out at the state level. And there wasn't press there, to document it.
The other thing to keep in mind, and this is not in a campaign way, but once a person is elected, a president is elected, we have seen he leapfrogs. I mean, President Obama, President Clinton, they've all done it, and that is, instead of going to the national reporter, or even the local print reporter, they'll go right to the local television person, call them into the White House, have the interview, talk to people that way, go on radio shows in those local communities. President Obama wouldn't sit down and give an interview with, say, a big name print reporter, but would show up on the Steve Harvey Morning Show and talk to the African American community directly. So there's a bunch of things happening. Local papers are disappearing, but then the national leaders see no need to talk to the national press or the local print press and just go through niches and go through other means.
I feel compelled to respond to what you've all said. I'm probably the only person who's actually dealt with Donald Trump myself on a business basis twice.
Tell us about that.
And I don't mean shaking his hand, I mean talking to him and dealing with him on business. Whoever said he's got a plan, he listens to anybody, that just isn't true. He's a shoot-from-the-hip guy. He'll do exactly what he says. He hasn't changed. He's 7 years old. I've dealt with him when he was 50-something and 60-something. He will do just what you said. He will come out with things all the time because that's the way he works. He will change his mind. He will tell you, because he told me what you said, I said yesterday doesn't count. What I say today counts. And again, he'll say what yesterday didn't count. You've never, at least I've never encountered somebody who's like that, and don't think he's going to change. I don't believe that 70-year-olds change. He's going to be just the way he was in White House, and the question's really going to be if all of his advisors can chain him in. Can they keep him from saying what he says on the tweets all the time? That's the way he is. Don't kid yourself. He's not going to change. He's 70.
I just want to support what we just heard and repeat something that Obama said last week in Fayetteville. I saw him down there. I was doing voter protection work, and he had a rally. And he said about Trump what he fears most after having been president for 8 years is that he's learned the presidency doesn't change you. It magnifies you. It magnifies your personality. It won't change it. And anyone who thinks, I feel, that he's got the potential to change or be impressed by the office is making a big mistake. He's only going to have a megaphone and be more of himself than we've seen up until now.
And he's also going to have, I think, consequences to his words and his actions that he did not have in the campaign. He could use all the rhetoric he wanted to in a campaign, and but as president, what he says and what he did, it's going to have instant consequences.
Let me offer a more hopeful note, but one that doesn't necessarily contradict what you gentlemen have just said, and that is, having covered him and watched him closely, he's not tied down to any strong ideological worldview, that's fair to say. But what he is driven by is a need for affirmation and a desire to be liked and respected. He's very responsive to the media coverage of him. That's the great irony. He savages the media, but he loves the media coverage. I mean, he sort of lives for it. He in 2016, he loves the idea of being on the cover of Time magazine. That's still a thing for him. The Times especially matters to him. He's a kid from New York, and he cares about what's on page one. And perhaps, Dale, you're shaking your head, but he does care about the coverage. And he cares about what people in elite places think of him, and he's very responsive to that. And that's why he changed his campaign so many times. It's because there were some tough stories, and he would shake up his campaign. Does that mean that he's going to, not break norms? Not necessarily, but I just think it's important to keep in mind that this is somebody who does want to be liked and respected. Look no further than how he responded to President Obama last week, when President Obama showed him some respect, and he lavished praise on President Obama afterwards. So
There's one other thing, which is, there's a limit to how much he can do with an executive order. He actually does have to deal with Congress, even though he'd prefer not to. And I think members of Congress are much more keenly aware of the political consequences of some of the things that Donald Trump proposes than perhaps he is. And they're not going to do a lot of that stuff. They're just not. But
Okay, we have time for one more question, so Joel.
So I thoroughly agree with Dale's theory that people of a certain age don't change. I'm probably one of them. Not quite as old as Trump. But for all of you, I'm curious, one thing that we know, and this is not political, fact checkers, independent fact checkers, as a candidate, Donald Trump lied at historic levels almost daily during the course of his campaign. Are there any conversations taking place inside of news organizations now as to how they will deal with it if the President of the United States or his press secretary dissembles and lies to the American people every day on factual information?
No. I mean, the day after the election, we were talking in our newsroom about covering his presidency very aggressively. And that's not something new for us. I mean, we cover presidents of both parties really aggressively. And, the saying of the Times is we, cover folks without fear or favor. And that goes back to the 19th century. And I think we're going to certainly conform to that tradition, Joel, very aggressively. And certainly I will, too.
I don't know what our news side is doing, but I would suspect that the conversations that happened at the Times have happened at the Post. I can say for the Washington Post editorial board, we made a decision early on in the campaign to take a stand against Donald Trump when he was a candidate, and pointing out as often as we could things that he lied about, policies that were unconstitutional or immoral, and keep banging the gong on those things. And now that he's president-elect,
more reason.
I know we feel like because we were out early warning against him, that now we feel an obligation to, like a heavier obligation than we otherwise would, to make sure that our readers know and understand exactly what he's saying, and when they are lies, we call them, because we're an editorial page and we're opinion writers, we are able to do that. The hard part is going to be whether the American public will care. That ultimately is the key thing.
Or, I'm sorry, just to follow up quickly, or is the news side approaching it any differently? I know you're on the editorial side. I hear about aggressive coverage, but this is a challenge for newsrooms and news editors, not editorial editors.
Right, no.
Because if his behavior doesn't change, you are on a daily basis going to have to figure out how to cover a president of the United States and a press operation that's likely to behave in the same way they did during the campaign.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.